All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending. My name is Terrell Engman. I'm the co-founder of Basilica Bio and PhD candidate studying breast cancer metastasis. I'm extremely excited to have our panelists with us from several departments and disciplines to help to demystify a deeply intersectional issue, which is climate resilience in practice for our communities. This is an issue near to us at Basilica Bio. We started 5 years ago to enact tangible changes in frontline communities, which are communities that experience the effects of climate change first and are impacted the hardest. And we want to enact those tangible changes toward health equity and environmental justice. We do this mainly through creating educational resources, hosting community events and discussions, youth programming, micro grants, really anything that moves us toward more resilient, equitable, healthy communities. The work that our panelists do is more important now than ever, with massive shifts in our economy to extractive new technologies and limp international proposals to curb greenhouse gas emissions. It's clear that the solution lies in our collective capacity to understand the issues and act to promote better futures for Washington state and beyond. We'd like to host more events like this. If you want to stay connected, please make sure to follow us on Instagram at Basilica Bio and sign up for our newsletter at basilicabio.org. With that, I'd like to invite our community outreach coordinators, Quinn Luthi and Carolyn Coyne, to kick us off.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Terrell. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and welcome to our virtual panel on climate resilience in King County. Uh, my name is Quinn Luthi. I use they, them pronouns, and I am one of Basilica Bio's community outreach coordinators. I am also a high school English and history teacher. And beyond that, I am a queer ecologist, and I recently graduated from the University of Utah's master's degree in environmental humanities. And I'll pass it over to Carolyn.
Hi everyone, I'm Carolyn. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming from undergrad at Pomona College, where I worked for 3 years with the Coastal Rumsen Carmel tribe, amplifying Indigenous storytelling around fire. So now, alongside my work with Basilica Bio, I also do habitat restoration and other environmental justice initiatives for the Washington Conservation Corps. So Quinn and I are both your outreach coordinators. Thank you so much for being here.
So before we begin introducing our incredible panelists, we want to acknowledge that while this event is virtual, Basilica Bio works in the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Coast Salish people. And we honor with gratitude the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, and Stillaguamish people and the land of what is now called King County. And it's really important to acknowledge that when we talk about resilience, because we have to recognize that systems of injustice in King County have failed to steward the lands, waters, and airs that we inhabit, and that some people are vastly more complicit than others in this failure. When we talk about resilience, we talk about rectifying these inequities and failures. When we talk about resilience, we do so knowing that what we call climate change is, in the words of Nick Estes, a lens through which to understand the world. Frontline communities in King County have faced countless harms which are threats to resilience. From the redlining of historically Black communities, to the failure to respect Indigenous sovereignty, to the siting of polluting industries in working class communities and communities of color, to the refusal to provide healthy food and safe drinking water to everybody. These historic injustices have inhibited frontline communities' abilities to adapt to a changing climate as King County faces more frequent and extreme weather events. We're literally doing this panel in the midst of a hardcore atmospheric river. Periods of heat stress, rising sea levels, and both physical and mental health inequities.
So, talking about climate resilience, as we're doing today, does two things. First, it names and redresses the systemic harm. And second, it imagines and creates environmental justice. Our work at Basilica Bio aims to do both. Our public programming, like this event, aims to make climate education free and accessible, which creates resilience through both skill and knowledge sharing. We have also built an environmental justice curriculum for teachers, which provides tools for students who will bear the brunt of the effects of climate change. Every year, we bring together a cohort of future climate leaders through our Bridge to Youth Leadership program and equip young people with tools to enact necessary change. Those applications are open right now for high school sophomores and juniors, so if you'd like to nominate a student, you can do so on our website. We also run a Meals in Need Today program, also known as MINT, which provides microgrants to different food providers in King County. MINT builds resilience by empowering communities to take control of their food and nutrition. MINT has also made a digital a digital booklet about food systems and resources in King County, and digital copies are available on our website. This event that you're at today, in particular, is funded by the Office of Sustainability and Environment as part of the City of Seattle's Climate Readiness Curriculum. We are hosting 3 resilience-themed events as part of this initiative, and I'm very happy to see some reoccurring faces from our last event, which was a mutual aid mixer at Tractor Tavern. If anyone would like to come to our next climate readiness event, we will be hosting a creative workshop on January 24th at Georgetown Recreative with a special guest, Eileen Lambert, a Latina climate storyteller. You can find this event on social media by signing up to our newsletter or by subscribing to our Luma calendar. Basilica Bio is also making a King County specific climate readiness booklet that will be released in spring 2026. This is very exciting and obviously quite topical. This resource has 2 sections, the first on climate change and environmental science topics like extreme weather events, and the second on hyperlocal practical climate preparedness. The booklet was written through an intersectional and evidence-based lens, and we are really excited to share it with you in a couple months. If you, your organization, or colleagues are interested in procuring some when they're released, please send us an email.
Thank you, Carolyn. So far, we have left a specific definition of climate resilience up in the air, and that is on purpose. So together with our panelists, we're going to interrogate this term and get to the bottom of how we can work towards resilient communities in King County. But before we start, I would like everyone to give a welcome to our incredible panelists. With us here tonight, we have Kat Hartwell with the Center for Disaster Resilient Communities, Dr. Jessica Hernandez with Earth Daughters, Jimmy Kralj with the Department of Ecology, Emily O'Donnell Pazderka, a climate disaster researcher, and Robin Schwartz with the Duwamish River Community Coalition. Panelists, if you would like to introduce yourself further in this order, please go ahead.
Thanks, Quinn. I'll start. I'm Kat Hartwell, and I'm the Assistant Director of Strategic Engagement with the Center for Disaster Resilient Communities, which is a mouthful. We're an interdisciplinary center focused on building resilience and preparing communities for disasters beyond King County and actually beyond the US. I actually got my entree into the climate change field as a documentary producer and storyteller, working on a documentary called Years of Living Dangerously on National Geographic. I focused on a story about ocean acidification and how ocean warming is impacting people whose livelihoods depend on ocean health. And that led me down a pathway that brought me to pursue a master's degree at NYU in global health and focus on the intersection of disaster preparedness, climate change, and public health. And in 2021, I had the opportunity to move to University of Washington and Seattle, moved to Seattle for my position at UW, where I was conducting research on extreme heat and climate adaptation at the state level. And I got to work on several projects. Last year, I led some climate adaptation work at Public Health Seattle King County, took a hiatus from UW, and we were working on extreme heat adaptation in South King County. And I'm back at University of Washington now with the Center for Disaster Resilient Communities and preparing communities for disasters. So thanks, really happy to be here.
My name is Dr. Jessica Hernandez. I'm from the Maya Chortin Binisan Nations, and I'm an Indigenous climate scientist. I am the Director of Research and Indigenous Science of Earth Daughters, a nonprofit that I actually founded in 2020. It used to be a mutual aid kind of collective where we supported Indigenous communities that were actually leading climate science and climate change work. I always say that we are funding Indigenous scientists just because, they don't necessarily have the Western credentials doesn't mean that they don't have the knowledge or expertise to do what's best to heal their land. I'm also an author of 2 books, one called Fresh Banana Leaves, the second one called Growing Papaya Trees, that has been quoted and cited globally to regional, where it kind of interrogates what Indigenous science is and why is it important to start bridging Western science with Indigenous science so that we can create more holistic solutions for our 7 generations to come. And thank you, Padichi, for having me here today.
Awesome. Good evening, everybody. Great to be here today. My name is Jimmy Kralj. I am the Climate Resilience Strategy Planner at the Washington State Department of Ecology. Department of Ecology is one of our state agencies here in Washington. We do all kinds of work around environmental issues, things like air quality, water quality, nuclear waste, everything in between. But a big part of the work that we do is around climate change and preparing for climate impacts. The agency does a lot of work on emissions reductions, which is, of course, critical to addressing climate. But a lot of the work that I do is focused on climate resilience. I've been with the agency for about 2 years and was brought on to help develop the state's new climate resilience strategy, which we published in September of 2024. The climate resilience strategy really looks at what our state agencies can do to help support communities, infrastructure, and natural and working lands across the state in preparing for the biggest climate hazards that we are going to be facing now and into the future. And so a lot of that work is really coordinating at the state level and figuring out how we can best support our partners and local communities across the state. My background is I grew up in Wisconsin. I moved to Washington about a decade ago for graduate school at UW. I worked a little bit in DC doing some policy in the Senate, doing ocean policy work there, and then moved back to Seattle and did a lot of salmon recovery planning and policy work as well. And now have been with the agency for about 2 years. So really excited about this work and kind of seeing how, like Quinn said, climate resilience is a huge topic and means lots of different things to lots of different people. And so it's been great to kind of plug into all these wonderful networks that we have at the state.
Do I think I'm next, Carolyn? Is that true? Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Emily O'Donnell Pazurka. I use she, her pronouns. And as our host said, I'm a climate disaster researcher. I have worked most recently at the Washington State Department of Health as the resilience and recovery strategist, but I am here tonight in my capacity as a private citizen scholar. Prior to moving to Washington, I worked in infectious disease surveillance and risk communications, emergency response, and clinical operations in the Midwest and South Florida and the Caribbean. Notably, I was deployed to the Caribbean Disaster Relief Center during Hurricanes Maria and Irma in 2017, and I oversaw the triage of perinatal displaced populations coming into the United States from the Caribbean. So that kind of started my career and my pursuit of graduate school. So from there, I got an MA in history, concentrated on survival migration, Cold War nuclear armament, and borderlands environmental studies. And then I pursued a master's of public health from Johns Hopkins in environmental health and emergency preparedness, where I continued to focus on nuclear toxicology and environmental epidemiology and the ways in which, in particular, Superfund sites impact the environmental health of our communities. And when I was at Hopkins, I had the incredible opportunity of being a co-author on the checklist to build trust, improve public health communications, and anticipate rumors during public health emergencies with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and a few other publications, tools, and resources that are really useful to helping scholars and practitioners and community organizers address rumors as they arise during and after emergencies. And as we all know, there's always a public health component with climate emergencies. As we know, especially when we're recovering from something like a flood, there's a lot to consider from a public health perspective. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, my name is Robin Schwartz. I use she, her pronouns. I work at the Duwamish River Community Coalition. We're an environmental justice organization based in the Duwamish Valley on the south end of the city. We started a little over 20 years ago. Fundamentally, we serve as a liaison between responsible parties and the Environmental Protection Agency and community to make sure that the communications about the cleanup are accessible and transparent. And in the Duwamish Valley, that's always meant making sure meetings happen not only during business hours, making sure they're culturally relevant, making sure materials are translated, interpreted, not at a super high level necessarily, childcare and food at meetings, that kind of stuff. And in the last 5 or 10 years, especially, we've become a little more intentional about the understanding that this community is not only impacted by environmental justice, but also by racial justice, social justice, economic justice. And so we have a lot of programs in addition to our Superfund program. And then I myself, my title is Advocacy and Community Resilience Manager. I had to write that down. And the way my job has evolved in the past few years. I live in South Park. I've lived here for almost 20 years, and a handful of years, well, 4 years ago, I realized that on my street, everybody has been impacted by the combined sewer system, which is designed to dump into the river when it's full, and then when the tide is high, it comes back. And so folks on my street have had inadequate or dangerous, utility service for decades. And right as we were in the middle of advocating for solutions to that, the river overtopped. This was in December of 2022. And coincidentally or not, it was the same folks that have been impacted by the CSO system. And that's been a big part of my job since then, is working with community to organize and to advocate, work with Seattle Public Utilities and also with King County, because South Park has parts of the neighborhood are unincorporated. So then we're involving multiple municipalities and just trying to make sure that community members are part of plans going forward to become more resilient and understand what's happening and understand their rights. And that's kind of my way into this conversation. So thank you so much for having us.
Sweet. Thank you so much, everyone. Without further ado, let's jump into questions. To clue everyone in the audience, we will first be asking questions for all of the panelists, and then specific questions, and then finally we will have the Q&A where you all can participate. So please, while we are in conversation, put any questions you have into the Q&A chat box, and we will get those answered during the Q&A portion. You may also ask your question actually yourself directly by using the raise hand button if you wish. So first up for our panelists, again, in the order that you just went in, if you could please share with us a formative environmental experience of joy.
Okay, I think that means I go first. So for me, a formative moment of joy is that I'm from South Florida originally, and my earliest memories really are of running along the beach, open sand with waves crashing, and my mom sort of throwing me into the waves when I was learning to swim. And that's like a real moment of pure delight when I think about it. And I think that early moment of environmental joy and exposure created in me a lifelong appreciation and love of the ocean that led me to even pursue this work. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. My memory will just be like growing up with my grandparents, especially understanding as I pursued higher academia that they did have the knowledge to kind of explain what was going on in our ecosystems and environments, but they might not necessarily have the technical terminology to be able to classify, like ocean acidification, sea level rise. And I would just say learning from them and also seeing how they taught me that the way that we look at our lands and our environments is through love, compassion, and also empathy, which is oftentimes missing from any course that you can take as a graduate student, undergraduate student, or sometimes in discussions that take place on these.
Yeah, this is a great question. I definitely have a lot from when I was younger, but I feel like just nowadays I'm looking more and more for kind of things in the current moment that keep that joy alive amidst some, difficult times. And I think for me, just being someone who works in a lot of policy areas, really seeing the impact of kind of that policy level and that planning work and what that looks like on the ground for communities. Like if it's a funding, package or a grant program that goes to a community to do a project that then makes them more resilient. I think, things like that just kind of get me really excited and hopeful for, doing this work and recognizing that we can really make a difference and progress in this space, even though there's lots of other, extenuating circumstances going on.
So the first thing that popped in my head when I read this question was a camping trip that my family took when I was pretty little. I think probably maybe around 9 or 10. We drove from my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska to Richmond, Virginia. And so we ended up driving through Appalachia. And it was the first time that I ever saw mountains. And we spent a significant amount of time camping in West Virginia. And for me, I reflecting just in the last hour on this, I actually think that that was pretty formative in pushing me towards this career path and this activism work that I do. In part because it was a beautiful experience for a girl from, the plains to see the mountains and the trees, and now to be here in Washington living in mountains and trees. But also, that's when I learned about coal mining. And so my family went to a few different coal mining museums, and I learned a lot about what Union towns were like in West Virginia. And so it's kind of funny for me to sit here and think about this because I actually think it shows what an impact it can be to provide environmental education and environmental joy to young people and also become aware of occupational health hazards. So that's kind of me just being nerdy, but it's a connection that I made for myself. So thank you for the question.
Let's see. I grew up in Seattle, but we were not a very naturey family. My dad's from New York City and my mom's from suburban New Jersey, so we weren't camping or anything like that. But when I was in high school, I worked summers at a YMCA camp on Orcas Island, and if you've been to the San Juans, you know that it's just pretty magnificent every minute of the day. And I was in high school and I was away from my folks, and so it was some pretty, I don't, big experiences with this big, amazing backdrop that have really stayed with me for many, many years. Oops.
Thank you so much, everybody. Like you were saying, Jimmy, we love centering joy when we're talking about these really important topics. So yeah, I guess to balance that question out, we want to ask all of you what you think a climate resilient King County looks like to you.
Okay, I'll kick us off. I like this question a lot. When I think about what a resilient King County looks like, I think about communities who know the climate risks that they're facing and most importantly have the tools to be able to respond and bounce back quickly when and if and when an event strikes. And so I think about, mutual aid networks being supported and resourced. I think about community-based organizations and faith-based organizations who are often the ones who know where to go and who needs the support first, and making sure that they're resourced and we have programs that continue to support those organizations.
It's a great cat. Yeah, I could not agree more with what you said. I think everyone else would probably agree too. I think for me, a lot of the work that I do is coming from a state agency is looking at like what tools and resources we can support partners with. And so I think for me, Resilient King County, is one that where we can provide tools that are adaptable and flexible to the, huge range of communities that we have in the county. Both overburdened and vulnerable communities in the county, folks who have different language, cultural needs, and really just kind of understanding the landscape of the people that are here and how we can best support them and making sure that the tools and support we can provide are as flexible as possible, which isn't always easy sometimes, but definitely a good thing to work for.
I would say it's important for us to acknowledge the histories that have taken place and kind of adding to what Kat was saying, that as a result of acknowledging this history, kind of funding more community-centered emergency responses and mutual aid. Like for instance, the nonprofit that I run, we give out micro grants to Indigenous communities who are doing environmental work, whether they call it environmental justice or climate justice, and we receive like 500 applications each round that we get open these applications. And that's because we are Indigenous led and centered. So it's Indigenous peoples who are reviewing these applications. They're not going to have barriers that it's going to question what they wrote or kind of push back on some of the terminology they use. And I think that we saw an increase of mutual aid during COVID. It's been a practice that many communities of colors have led, but it's because the government is failing communities of color. And I think that as a result of that, whether we work in a government agency or not, it's important for us to uplift those community-centered mutual aids that are taking place because they're always popping up, even with the floods, right? There's a lot of mutual aids that are going on in social media because the government is kind of slow to act. And then when there is a pocket of money, they always decide to support communities who have the power and privilege that oftentimes leaves communities who are the most vulnerable out of that equation.
So, full disclosure, I don't live in King County. I think I might be the only person on the, I should have said that earlier, who doesn't. I live in Thurston County. But obviously, I'm very invested in this work for all Washingtonians and all Western Washington folks. Um, so the thing, in addition to the amazing thoughts everyone has already shared, I'm thinking a lot about communication. And so, when we have well-resourced mutual aid networks and we have the socio-historical context and the empowerment from that standpoint, I think a really critical thing to be building into that work is understanding how we communicate, when we communicate, and especially, if we need to be doing it in multiple languages or if we need to be, accounting for access and functional needs. And I think especially increasingly, it's important to know how to navigate rumors or misinformation. One of the things just this week, as I've been monitoring the flooding, I've seen a lot on social media of people somewhat hysterically and rightfully so saying, where do we find out? How do we find out if we need to be evacuating? Where do we go? And so I think having streamlined ways at the community level and at the micro level of understanding, knowing your neighbor, like knowing your community in a way that allows you to be able to communicate if you lose power, if you don't have access to a phone, or communications devices, you have those mutual aid networks of relationship that allow that communication to be present. And also then if, there's miscommunication or misinformation that you're navigating, you're doing that as a community, which I think empowers you to handle that in a way that's useful and efficient.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I don't probably have any amazing insights after you guys all went, but the notes I took, I talked about just making, or not making sure, but working on being proactive. Obviously we're at we're behind the curve of where we should be, but trying as much as we can to be thinking ahead. I talked about equity. I think we need to be protective or prioritizing the most vulnerable communities, serving them first, and then a rising tide will rise all boats. And kind of along the same lines, just to acknowledge the cumulative effects of what else is out there. Yes, do people have do they have cars? Are they renters? Are they renting a basement apartment? Just all and everything else like environmental justice and other types of pollution. And is there bus service? And just making sure that we are as intentional as possible about the different levels of privilege that become even more apparent in an emergency. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. And Robin, your answer too about the different timescales of when we're preparing for these emergencies and the response pivots excellently into our next question. So thank you. And I have a suggestion too for panelists, if you're okay with perhaps reversing the order. Okay, great. Sounds great. So Robin, you'll be up first for this question, which is how can we balance communities' present material needs with working towards a long-term vision of a just future? I also recognize I just asked y'all to do the alphabet backwards, so just jump in whenever. I trust you all to be able to speak in a certain order. But again, the question is, how can we balance communities' present material needs with working towards a long-term vision of a just future?
Well, for a second, I thought that I hadn't made a note on that question. I was going to have to think on the fly, but luckily I have my notes here so I can go. So I was just thinking about combining economic investment with environmental justice and climate resilience. So stuff like green job training, support and wraparound programs for job and career pathways. Yeah, and just understanding what the needs are, um, and ensuring or working so that our solutions don't cause more problems. Bringing addressing the problems along with or wrapping current solutions into the climate solutions is kind of what I was thinking. Thanks.
I think I'm next. Um, so I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm also a board member of the Olympia Free Clinic, which is a clinic here in Olympia that provides healthcare services and mental health services and specialty care at no cost to our community. And so that's something I've been thinking about with this question in particular is material needs in terms of healthcare. And I think, when we're talking about climate resilience, that health isn't necessarily something that's top of mind. We're thinking a lot about, clean jobs and energy and sustainable climate planning. But also, I think there's a lot to be said for having your healthcare needs met so that if and when there's a disaster, any health issues that folks have that might be underlying or acute or chronic might get exacerbated. So, for example, thinking about insulin and ensuring that insulin access is available, that's a life-saving medication for folks. And if we don't have access, if the pharmaceutical chain is disrupted, that can be a huge problem from a health equity perspective. And so I think when we're thinking about a long-term vision of a just future, obviously, we want, as Robin said, the rising tide that lifts all boats. And I think for me, and when I'm thinking about all of this, I'm always thinking about that healthcare component and how we're ensuring that folks are receiving care, especially now as we go forward with the cuts that we're all anticipating to healthcare.
Yeah, thanks. This is a great question. I think that responding to immediate needs and planning for the future is really all about what climate resilience is about. I think, to be successful in that, I think like you have to really build in community needs and values into all the work that we're doing, if it's short-term responses or long-term planning. I think the Department of Commerce at the state level has been doing some really cool work in this space. There's a state law that requires basically cities, counties, and the state have these things called comprehensive plans, which are their like long-term kind of planning documents. And there was a state law a few years ago that, excuse me, that required like climate resilience to be a component of those comprehensive plans. And so Department of Commerce has kind of oversees this process and has been doing some really cool work. And they had some money from the legislature over the past 2 years to directly fund community participation in those processes in all parts of the state. I think they awarded funding to 24 community organizations. And that really enabled, it compensated people for their time to directly participate in those planning meetings. It provided food or childcare, all sorts of like great resources that really enabled people from communities to be at the table with their county or city planners in planning what that vision looks like. And so I think, that model is something that is really important in making sure that, these long-term plans are, guiding us into a future that we want to get to. And then at the same time, making sure that we have the resources and support to help people deal with the problems they're facing right now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I would say that it's important for us to look at meeting needs where they're present tense or long term as building relationships and not necessarily just doing transactions. I often think of like how in social media, right, the relationships that we have tend to be a little bit more transactional, where for Indigenous Peoples Days or Native American Heritage Month, a lot of Indigenous-led organizations are kind of uplifted, but the rest of the year, there's no uplifting of organizations. The same happens to many communities of color. And I think that oftentimes it's important to understand that we are building relationships that will be grounded in trust. Many of us, and there's research out there that shows that many of us just donate to nonprofits or organizations. And then it's kind of like checking off a box. And then we don't necessarily look at what the organization is doing or how they're using their money or what kind of events they're promoting. And I think that oftentimes that's more of a transactional kind of good deed as opposed to actually building a relationship that allows us to actually look at the social media, look at the events, come to the events that they're planning, and so forth. So I say, building on that relationship, that's very important, especially in the era of social media after the pandemic, how those interpersonal relationships kind of have gone away in some matters, especially with the newer generation.
I really like what everybody's had to say, and it's hard to think about what else to add on. These are such great ideas. I think the only thing when I thought of this question that I could add is that, as we're thinking about meeting immediate needs for community, making sure that we're trying to center sustainability as we do that for the long-term just future. So I know that the 2025 to 2030 King County Strategic Climate Action Plan, that's also a mouthful, but it just passed with the King County Council. In there are lots of great ideas for programs that weatherize old housing, retrofit old housing, which is where a lot of our renters are, and that can help reduce emissions and stop with energy waste, and also programs that uh, incorporate renewable energy and heat pumps and that kind of thing into new facilities that are being built for affordable housing. So just again, thinking about that sustainability as we're thinking about how to meet needs now.
I agree with you, Kat. I really like what all of you have to say, especially how all of your answers are reflecting the totality of what we need to make climate justice, like building lasting relationships as climate justice, health justice as climate justice, and vice versa. So this next question is kind of in that frame as well. We wanted to ask, what is something people might be overlooking about disaster preparedness in King County? And that answer might be something specific to a like geographical area, or it might be something more broad.
I can start again. So yeah, I am going to take this sort of more hyper focus into South Park. One thing that we've really struggled with in the past few years is serving both city residents and county residents. Like I said, we have it's called the Sliver by the River. It's just a little bit of unincorporated King County. And the capacity, I think, between Seattle Public Utilities and King County Wastewater Treatment Division is really, uh, there's a big difference. SPU has, I think, a lot more people and money focused on the Duwamish Valley, and for King County, it's just one of a whole bunch of little bitty unincorporated places that they're trying to. Well, I mean, and the rest of the county too. So that's been surprising to us. We have been really trying to learn how to navigate working with these two governments. It's been really frustrating for community members, especially folks who live in the sliver. I mean, they see this difference in every way. The Seattle Public Utilities had to pay for the houses to be cleaned and remodeled after the river flooded, but the county was not obligated to do that and didn't or wasn't able to. So, yeah, just navigating those municipal differences and really trying to honor what we see as the rights of people in this community to have the same services and to be treated with the same level of care. Thanks.
So again, I am not personally in King County, and I was thinking, kind of big picture answers. There are lots of environmental hazards that are specific to this area that we're all familiar with, but something that kind of pinged me a little bit was the idea of a go bag. And one of the things that I thought a lot about since I started working here in Washington is, we really do need that. We need emergency kits, we need go bags, but it is expensive to compile one. When I first moved here and I came from hurricanes, and then I moved to Washington and I was like, oh, I need like survival gear. And in order to do that, it costs a decent amount of money. And it was prohibitive for me and my family when we first moved here for about a year to really compile what I felt like was a comfortable go bag. And so I think when we're talking about, networks of community care, that's certainly something that we can and should be thinking about is like, how can we, from a mutual aid perspective, kind of acquire the things that we might need as a community, whether we're stockpiling them, as a group, whether we're helping provide them for individuals. I think that's definitely something that our community-based organizations and our networks can be thinking about outside of the government, and how we can really be providing for those needs at the local and hyperlocal levels.
Yeah, I think, what I was going to talk about is very similar to what Robin brought up, but I think it's just, recognizing that the county is very socially and geographically diverse, right? You've got city of Seattle, but then you have tiny towns like Skycoma, and up in the Cascades. And I think just that the scale of issues and challenges can get really hyper local and also big at countywide scale, and that can be really challenging. We've dealt with that a lot at the state level about looking at shared hazards like extreme heat, for example, is going to impact all parts of the state. But your response in a urban community in Seattle is going to be extremely different from your response in a rural community in Eastern Washington. And that same dynamic is really at play as you get at the county level, the city level, even like the block level, things like that. So I think just keeping that front of mind in this work, and again, like having tools that are adaptable and just not a one size fits all approach is hard, but definitely very necessary to actually make sure people are becoming more resilient and their communities are becoming more resilient.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing. I think that one of the things that I would like to mention is that it's important for us to make it culturally relevant. I still recall when Indigenous elders came to us with food baskets because they had gone to a food drive, and they receive a lot of kale. And for them, this was the first time they had ever seen kale. They didn't know how to cook kale. This is not a tradition of food that is, in most Indigenous communities. But because this food drive, right, and bringing in that, oh, we're trying to do good without bringing the culture in, they just gave them kale. So we had to teach them how to cook kale. Also going back to the emergency kits, right? Oftentimes there's like blankets and things that for culturally are not necessarily things that we owned or things that we might need. For instance, the Coast Salish peoples, right, their cedar hats are waterproof. And that's because the way that they weave it, they don't get wet. So why do we ask them to bring in an umbrella instead of saying, oh, you should bring your cedar hat? So I think it's bringing in that cultural component, the cultural relevancy into the emergency preparedness that we do, and also the sustainability and support that we also give these communities, especially if we are hosting food drives, right? Because some of them are not necessarily food baskets that our people know how to cook. So if that's the case, add up, like a cooking book or something that will help us make sure that the support or help that we are providing actually makes sense for the communities that we serve.
Great answers, everybody. I will just add that one of the things I love about the region, and I'll zoom out for Emily's sake, beyond King County, is that we are surrounded by water and we're connected by bridges and ferries. And that's really vulnerable infrastructure. And people may not be thinking about that. We enjoy it when the weather's good, but when there's a climate disaster, it's something that puts us all a little bit at risk. We may not be able to get to hospitals. We may not be able to check on a family member. And so I think it's really important thinking about the vulnerability of the infrastructure system of the region to plan ahead, think about alternative routes ahead of time. I was going to plug go bags, but Emily already did that for me. I've got two, one in the car, one in my house, and big fan of the go bag. And I know, shout out to Basilica Bio, because I know a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago, they did an event helping community members build go bags that I think, to your point, Jessica, could be culturally relevant and have things that people would actually use. So I think planning ahead is really important.
Thank you so much, everybody. We actually are having a go bag raffle at the end of this event, so we'll take down the names of all the participants and reach out to all of you afterwards. I also wanted to comment just really fast on what you said, Kat, about yeah, the infrastructure. Like Duval is an island right now because they had to close off all the roads connecting them to the mainland because of the atmospheric rivers. So now we're going to shift into specific questions for each panelist. If somebody else would like to jump in, you're welcome to do so. So our first question is going to be for Robin, and we wanted to ask what it means to steward a polluted place.
Thanks, Quinn. Um, so that is a good question. I think sort of my main thought about that is just to really be cognizant of the intersectionality. Like I mentioned in my intro, environmental justice doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's so many other things. I mean, just the littlest things like we have really poor air quality here, some of the poorest air quality in the city and the county. Because there's freight routes and we're next to two airports and we're in a valley, which does something to the air. Uh, and and our elementary school, they only have a nurse 3 days a week. So here we have the highest childhood um, asthma hospitalization rates in the county, and we have almost half the time the admin secretary has to take care of the kids in the nurse's office. And so it's just really being cognizant that it's not just climate, it's not just pollution, it's not just transportation and housing, and working, you know, uh, working on those issues, but obviously seeking out partners because we can't do it all. So yeah, just being thoughtful and making good partners to address all of the intersections. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Robin. Our next question is for Dr. Hernandez. How do you bridge Indigenous science, traditional ecological knowledge, and Western frameworks? Can you provide an example?
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that question. I think that oftentimes one of the ways that I do that is by pushing scientists to stop thinking in binaries. Like all of us who ended up pursuing a Western science degree, we're taught that the scientific method is the way that we should look at things, right? And my work right now, especially my research project, is focusing on renewable energy. So we know that renewable energy will allow us to kind of stop depending so much on fossil fuels. However, because we are thinking about renewable energy from this binary lens where we are, using the scientific method, we're saying this is a problem, which is like our dependency on fossil fuels, and this is a solution, renewable energy. When in reality, renewable energy is actually leading genocides that are taking place today. Like for instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? We are seeing how indigenous people from Congo are facing this genocide because we are extracting cobalt from their land so that we can power the renewable energy industry. We're also seeing the Paiute tribe in Nevada, which is not that far from us, also experiencing lithium mining because lithium is also another rare mineral that we need to power renewable energy. So the way that I integrate indigenous sciences into Western science is by pushing the needle into what we view as science and how do we think in more holistic systems that are not necessarily binary, where we're focusing on the problem and here's the solution, but we're going to ignore all these other webs that are interconnected to the problem and solution that we're trying to address. So that's one of the things that I always bring up forward, especially the research kind of supports a lot of global advocacy work that I'm doing with the United Nations because again, we're trying to remove ourselves from the fossil fuel industry, but then the renewable energy solutions are leading, genocides against indigenous peoples because again, we're putting these people who want power, land, and money into positions of power who are now owning these renewable energy sources.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was really awesome. Our next question is for Jimmy, switching a bit towards the state level. Can you tell us about leading the development of Washington's climate resilience strategy? Huge kudos on that, by the way. Just so everyone in the audience is aware, Jimmy did lead that, as well as the implementation of how that is going.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So all of this work was directed by a law that the legislature and former Governor Inslee passed in 2023, and was really sort of born out of this idea that a lot of our state agencies are doing a lot of really great work to build climate resilience, to help communities, help infrastructure, help our natural and working lands. And so, but there's definitely a need to coordinate that, and there's also a need to do more, right? And so the challenges that we're facing are, bigger than the work that agencies were already doing. And so the legislature passed this law that really kind of directed all of us to work together and come up with a more strategic approach at the state agency level of how we want to best support communities and infrastructure in dealing with climate impacts. And instead of, working in our own individual lanes, really working together with some shared goals and shared priorities. And what the strategy really does, sort of presents like a menu of options for the legislature and the governor's office to consider as they're doing funding requests or legislation or other things like that, and really identifying some of the highest priority things that our state agencies can do to best support people and communities in the state. And so we published the strategy just about a year ago in September 2024. In that first year, we've made lots of really great progress on implementing the actions that our agencies included in there. You may or may not know, for folks listening, the state is in a really tough budget crunch right now, with a very, very big deficit in several of our state budgets, and that has had some real impacts on our work. We saw a number of actions from the strategy get funded by the legislature, but it was often at a much lower amount than we were originally requesting. But I will say, that we're not using this as an excuse to not act, right? This is, if anything, this is an opportunity for us to really get creative and to be even more strategic about how we want to do this work and support our communities. We've seen really great support from our agency leadership as well. One of the parts of the strategy sort of recommended that in addition to the staff that all worked on this from our 10 agencies, that our leaders also coordinate in this space. And so just 2 weeks ago, we had our first meeting of a climate resilience council. And so we had the directors and secretaries of our 10 state agencies kind of coming together, and they'll be meeting about twice per year to really provide that agency leadership level direction in support of our staff work. And so we've got the Commissioner of Public Lands and the Ecology Director are sort of co-chairing that work moving forward. So, definitely a lot of challenges that at the moment. The federal stuff, of course, is a huge issue as well. But in spite of this, making some real progress and just having the strategy gives us a really useful framework to center all of our work and make sure that we're all moving in the same way together, and we're not, impeding each other's progress, and really trying to make the biggest difference that we can.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Yeah, when we talk about climate resilience, we're going from these huge international, national scales all the way down to the local scale. And this next question is for Emily, kind of talking about a very broad issue. So for Emily, we were wondering how health equity is connected to climate resilience. And you've all talked about this a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Quinn. So, yeah, we've all kind of touched on it a little bit. I've mentioned it a couple times because, as I said, it's pretty much the lens with which I view most of these issues. Um, but I think it might be useful first to define some terms. So, health equity is essentially the concept that health is a human right and that all folks, no matter what their needs are, deserve healthcare and access to quality healthcare. And then, obviously, climate resilience. We're all here to discuss climate resilience. And so, I think when we approach this question, how is health equity connected to climate resilience? The first thing that I think about is the concept of interdisciplinary approaches to this issue. A serious problem like climate change requires a serious solution, which necessitates interdisciplinary action. And so, if we believe in the connectedness of all things, which I think everyone here tonight likely does, then we understand that there is an inherent connection between health equity and resilience to emergencies in general, but then also climate resilience. And so, I think it's useful to think about it specifically when we're talking about the atmospheric river that is currently happening, because we're all very aware of it right now, and it's a live concern and it's a live emergency. And I'm sure plenty of folks know folks who are impacted. Um, and so when we're talking about a community's resilience to an emergency, whether it be climate or a pandemic, or something, of that nature, it's essentially this question of, is the community able to bounce back and recover from the problem and the emergency? So then when we add this climate resilience lens, we're talking about a natural disaster. And so how are our communities able to prepare for, respond to, and recover from the impacts of that disaster, be it a flood or a hurricane or an earthquake or what have you? And so when we come back to this concept of health equity, and kind of like I mentioned earlier, how healthy are our people? How healthy is our population, like from a physical health standpoint? And then there's also the consideration of mental health, because disaster behavioral health is another huge issue. The trauma that can come from suffering through a disaster is severe and lifelong and can be debilitating. So, coming from a holistic health perspective, thinking about that equity piece, specifically to climate resilience, we're also thinking about those environmental health risks. So, after the disaster is over, how are we monitoring and providing surveillance? So, you know, we might have, in the case of South Park, for example, the flood that happened in 2022, I'm sure, Robin, that we're still dealing with some issues from that flood. And so the long-term effects and making sure that that's being monitored, and how our children who experience the disaster impacted later in life because of that disaster. So these are all health equity questions. And it's important to keep in mind the ways that we can mitigate those issues from a health perspective, while also viewing it as part of the whole connected piece of the climate resilience solution.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciated how you mentioned all the different lenses and disciplines that come with this work. And again, just to reiterate, we at Basilica are so happy to have all you panelists here today with all your different niches and lived experiences and expertise. It's really cool to see so many different people come together on the same issue. Our next question is for Kat about your professional space. So, what is the role of academia when it comes to climate resilience? What about community-based research?
Well, great question. And Emily teed me up really well, I think. Academia plays lots of roles when it comes to climate resilience, and I'll start with providing an evidence base. We collect and analyze the data and interpret that data for the public, and as well as for the, building on previous research, continuing to grow the science. But when it comes to community, that's the critical piece, right? Like, we need to know what questions community has, and let community lead some of those questions. So post-disaster, community may ask, what exactly is in my water in this flooded area? And then they can work with researchers who can, do the hard science and then come back and report, which is a critical piece of academia as well. And so I think, providing the evidence base for the questions that are affecting the most impacted is a huge piece. And then also that goes to policymakers, that research, because a lot of the time policymakers are looking for data-driven information to form policies and strategies. But the other thing that academia does is cultivate partnerships and provides that space for people to gather. So we have a project with the Center for Disaster Resilient Communities called Living with Water, which works very closely with the Duwamish River Community Coalition. And that's, academia and community exploring adaptation strategies for flooding, which feels obviously very appropriate today when we're experiencing this atmospheric river. But that is more specifically for the Duwamish River. It's worth noting we have those kinds of collaborations, and they're really important. We also work with tribal partners, identifying hazards for tribes across Washington and figuring out what hazards to prioritize for research there. And then training up the next generation of researchers is another key piece for academia, and a role that we play, because by training up that next generation of researchers, we're really growing our impact. And a lot of the time it is that those, sort of early career researchers who are boots on the ground, working with community and asking new questions. And so that's another piece that academia plays. But I'm curious if Dr. Hernandez has anything to add, because she also is in the academia space.
Yes, Kat, I think you covered it mostly. I think also it's kind of like, not practicing helicopter research. I know that oftentimes in academia, we're taught that we should create the question, create the problem that we're trying to address, and then we go into the community and collect the data, and then we come back, right? And I think that oftentimes we are seeing more of that scholarship or research kind of push against helicopter research. And it goes back to one of the questions that we had earlier, which we all mentioned that it's important to build relationships and not necessarily just do transactions. And I think that that's a great way to segue into, the work that we're all doing on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez, and thank you, Kat. Kat, you teed up Robin really well by mentioning the Duwamish, so thank you for that. You are making my job a lot easier. So the next question is for Robin. How do residents of the Duwamish River adjacent communities in Seattle face additional barriers to building resilience?
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I feel like what I'm going to be talking about here, other folks have mentioned maybe in a more general sense, but it certainly rings true for me. I think one of the issues we have is just a lack of understanding of what the different pathways to flooding are. Here in the
Did she cut out for you guys? Okay. Robin, can you hear us? No.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Maybe
Sorry,
wind back
I
like 15 seconds.
okay,
No
okay.
worries.
I was just saying that learning about the pathways to flooding, that is, we have groundwater, overland, stormwater, riverine, and if we don't understand what they are, it's difficult for us to advocate for the ways to address them. Also, they combine, and it's just so just sort of this lack of a general understanding of what's happening to us and how then we want to, make steps forward. Like I mentioned before, lack of cohesion between governments and policymakers. A lot of our folks most impacted, English is not their first language. A lot of our folks are low income and or renters. I think survey exhaustion comes up. People have been coming into the Duwamish Valley for many years, asking what we think about our problems and then leaving. So folks can be wary of more surveys. Trauma and stress, like that were just mentioned, from that one flood. People are really on edge every time it rains now, and then also just the many years of sewer issues, um, and then I feel like a lot of if there's a real displacement risk, any of our folks that are most impacted by flooding in South Park, they're not going to buy another house in South Park. I mean, and also there's the moral issue. Like, do we want to sell to the next poor sucker to have this house, which is its own thing. But there's not. These houses are I'll just say the most affordable in South Park and in the city, and people really love South Park and don't want to leave this community. And I've heard it mentioned over and over again that we. This is people's home, and as risky as it is to live here, people have put down roots, and they know the librarian, and they know the teachers, and they know the folks that do youth engagement programs, and for a lot of us, we'd rather sit tight and see what we can because we don't want to lose this community. So I think all of these make it challenging to be resilient here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robin. You teed up the next question so good. You're all doing so great. You're blurring the line between panelist and host, so I really appreciate all of you. Um, so for Jimmy, we wanted to ask what inclusive and equitable engagement looks like at the Department of Ecology.
Yeah, thanks, Quinn. And well, first of all, to Robin's point of like the survey fatigue, like that is very real. I mean, I work for the agency that probably contributes to that in many ways, but we recognize that there was a lot of really excellent work that was done by other agencies, but also communities themselves, like directly preparing reports about challenges they face and issues that are really affecting them. And so as we developed the strategy, the first kind of part of our outreach and engagement phase was really looking through a lot of that work that was already out there, to help us, kind of get a better baseline of like where we kind of were and sort of what was important for communities. And then we followed a pretty, I think it was a unique approach for our agency, in terms of our outreach and engagement. We actually had funding available, and we partnered, excuse me, we partnered directly with an organization called Front and Centered. They're a coalition of environmental advocacy groups from communities all across Washington. And we were able to work with them and to sort of have them lead a lot of the outreach that we did around the climate resilience strategy and working directly with the communities that they already have those very strong and trusted relationships with. And so we sort of had a two-phase kind of that approach. The first was sort of right as we were getting started with our work, front and center, pulled together a group of folks from their organizations that they represent to really provide a lot of that baseline information about, what are the biggest climate resilience challenges facing these communities? What are, things that have worked well, things that have not worked well, some gaps they're facing, really kind of getting that baseline information. We then used that as we developed a draft of the state's climate resilience strategy, really pulling from a lot of that feedback that we got from front and center through the community partners. And then before we released our draft for public comment, we went back to front and center and they actually reviewed it with the same communities to really, see if we sort of hit the mark with what we were hearing from them. And so doing that before our official public comment period gave us some time to then kind of go back and tweak some things. We added a couple of different actions, took a few out, and then we were able to release it for public comment. And just that sort of process was really, really helpful for us. First of all, because we have very limited capacity. It was basically myself and one other person kind of leading some of this work. And then we also have really limited time. And so just being able to leverage a group like Front and Center that has so much experience and has so much trust and value with these communities that we're really want to center in our work at the agency level. We were just tremendously grateful for that, and it made for a really strong product in the end.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I really appreciated hearing about the commitment to direct partnership and communications with community members, especially within these constraints. You mentioned the huge budget deficit and also limited capacity. It's really awesome to hear that you and your colleagues are committed to this. I wanted to ask Emily a question also about communications, but specifically risk communications. You've touched on this topic. Can you expand a bit more on how risk communications can be strategically used to empower community resilience to climate threats?
Thanks, Carolyn. So not to repeat this too much, but thanks, Jimmy, for the tee up, because I would like to actually break this question into two parts because you're asking me about groups, agencies, and organizations. So following Jimmy, I would like to say that the Department of Ecology is doing great. Agencies really need to work on working with best practices for engagement and leveraging those trusted messengers. So everything that he said about the way that they're engaging in a really meaningful way with trusted messengers, I think is key. And that's really what I would recommend to any folks on the call who work for an agency or a government entity, especially as Dr. Hernandez said earlier, we need to come to the table with a clear understanding of historical harms. And so as government entities, we need to be coming with that perspective, and then also with the cultural humility of understanding that community engagement and trusted messengers need to be the ones, kind of on the front lines as a liaison communicator. And that will also just enhance the trust of the actual information that is being shared. So when we're talking about risk communications, that's a little bit different than community engagement, because risk communications is, talking about the potential for danger, the potential for loss of life, the potential for health concerns, or ways to monitor and mitigate health concerns, or safety concerns, health and safety, I would say. And so then I was going to just really reiterate the importance of trust building and utilizing trusted messengers. So the bigger the organization, the more important that is. But when we're talking about organizations and groups, that trusted messenger status is often built in, especially when we're talking about community building. And so I think building relationships and partnerships is key. And also, wherever possible, building relationships with other organizations. And so, like Basilica Bio is doing an incredible job. Just this panel is a great example. And so, when we are talking about risk communications very specifically, and unfortunately, this is something that we're seeing almost every other day at this point, is we're getting information from what previously were trusted messengers, whether they're in the healthcare space or the climate space or a regulatory area. We're getting mixed messages and or rejection of expert risk communications. And so understanding how to manage rumors and catching them early is really critical, and then figuring out who those trusted messengers are and how we can kind of guard those folks against the misinformation or the rumors that are being shared, especially if they're coming from what might be reputable, and helping folks kind of have that science and media literacy to understand how to sift through that. And it's hard. It's hard for the experts at this point. Like, we're all having a hard time figuring out what's true, what's still good science, what's still good recommendation. And so that's where the trusted messengers are really key. And I would recommend for folks interested in learning more about this or more resources, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security has a website completely dedicated to providing some of the social psychological information about rumors and misinformation, and then resources and very practical application opportunities like toolkits and things like that for folks to use. So as I mentioned earlier, there's some articles about building trust, and then there's also a playbook for addressing rumors specifically. So I would highly recommend that website if you're interested in more information.
Thank you so much, Emily. We really just asked you, hey, how do you solve climate resilience communication? And you gave us a very thorough and amazing answer. So thank you so much. We've got one more question before we move on to audience questions, and it's for Dr. Hernandez. So your new book, Growing Papaya Trees, Nurturing Indigenous Roots During Climate Displacement, which we are all so excited to read. We also all love your last book, Fresh Banana Leaves. And yeah, congratulations. So you're examining how land displacement, cultural continuity, and ancestral ties in that book. How is climate resiliency related to cultural resiliency?
Yeah, thank you, Quinn, for asking that question. I often say this, especially working in global advocacy spaces and also more national advocacy spaces, that we're often kind of remove that cultural resiliency, especially from climate resiliency. And as Indigenous peoples, even though we're displaced, we're still upholding our cultural ties, whether that displacement is externally across man-made borders or internally, where we are displaced from our reservations into the cities just because of many factors. I also say that when I was writing this book, right, I wasn't expecting the anti-immigration narrative to be very harmful and violent like it is today. And oftentimes it's important for us, especially when we're doing climate advocacy or in these climate science spaces, to mention that immigration is highly related to climate change. One of the things that I often think about is a famous quote that went viral on Twitter when Twitter used to be Twitter, where it said that we're closer to becoming a climate refugee than a billionaire. And oftentimes people do not necessarily look at climate change or climate refugees as something that they should look at or support or help or amplify or bring to the climate change spaces, when in reality, all of us are actually closer to becoming a climate refugee than a billionaire. And that book kind of highlights that even though we are displaced, we are still upholding our cultural values, tying it to one of the public questions, right? We are also joyful, we celebrate. I know that oftentimes when we talk about resistance or resilience, we often think of the doom or gloom, but in reality, many of our people celebrate. Like, for instance, when we fund natural disaster relief recovery in the global south, one of the things that the communities often do is that when they rebuild their homes, when they get all the food sources, they make a little celebration. And I think that that helps kind of address some of the mental health or trauma that happens when there is a natural disaster that takes place within a community, is that we bring that joy and celebration into our everyday lives, even when we have to struggle and experience those traumatic events. So I would say that cultural resiliency equates climate resiliency in that sense. Thank you so much for that thoughtful question.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move into the audience questions. And the reason that so I'm going to start with one that is not the very first one. And the reason is because this audience member, Sarah Olson, was asking a question that we were going to ask you, Kat. So you were talking in your introduction how you have like changed careers like quite a few times throughout your life. And we were curious how people who want to get involved with climate resilience and restorative justice can use their skills from previous careers to pivot into new ones, and also how people can join the field of community engaged research and academia.
Okay, I'll tackle both of those questions, but I really love this question because I really think that the issue of climate justice, climate resilience is so huge. There's room for everyone. And one of the resources that I wanted to point people to is the climate Venn diagram, which is very easy to find on, when you do your search engine, you just type that in. It's by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. And it's this idea that you ask these three questions. The first is, what are you good at? The second is, what work needs doing, which is lots. And the third is, what brings you joy? And you can find your place in the climate space and the intersection of those things. That's where you as an individual belong. And so that for me, I was a storyteller first and a producer. I'm good at logistics, but I really like working with community and direct impact. So that's how I found my way to academia and public health and research and community engaged research. But I think that looks different for an artist who might, make posters for climate events, or someone who I know who's a baker who might do a bake sale to raise money for, an environmental issue that they're passionate about that they haven't been involved in before. There's so many different ways that can look. So I would start with that. And then with the second part of that question about academia, I also think that the Ayanna's Venn diagram works out really well because, are you interested in economics? Are you better at science? Are you interested in ecology? There's still continue to be so many places. And I think that, if you're not pursuing a college degree, I think that you can look into certificate programs and find your path to education that way as well. But there's lots of space and lots of fields. Climate change touches everything. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that answer. That was amazing. Another question we have from the chat box. This is anonymous attendee for all panelists, so anyone can answer. Any advice for our mental health and anxiety surrounding climate change? I feel very helpless, and I know a lot of other people do as well. Even as someone who works in conservation and restoration, I still feel like I'm not helping solve the problem. Do the experts have any coping mechanisms?
Would it be all right if I take a crack at this one? Actually, reading it, I teared up a little bit. So I do want to thank this attendee for asking this really vulnerable question that I know we all experience in varying degrees. And I would like to be vulnerable in response and tell you that I struggle with this pretty seriously. And even just this past weekend, I kind of had this moment of just feeling really desolate about it all, knowing that these floods were coming. And this kind of sounds cheesy, but what I actually did is I made a very intentional effort to sit down and watch the National Geographic documentary about Jane Goodall's life. And so and I wept like a baby through like the second half of it, highly recommend it. And so this is an example of really the coping mechanism that I'd like to share, which is I really lean on art and especially stories from the folks who have been in this struggle, before me. And also looking to my inspiring colleagues and young people. And that's something that Jane's documentary really talks about a lot, is the way that we educate young people. And I'm also tangentially, I'm reading right now Alice Walker's Everything We Love Can Be Saved. And that quote kind of just runs in the back of my mind all the time, especially when I'm feeling really down. And what I tell myself is that, while I'm getting inspiration from these, patron saints of climate change resilience, I also am intentionally making the effort to plan for survival. And I think that's ultimately like the most radical act of hope that we can make, is by coming to these tables and having these discussions and doing this work, whether it's as private citizens, whether it's professionally, whether it's communally. Committing to survival, I think, is ultimately the most radical thing that we can do. And I know that sometimes it feels hard and you're not alone. But if we show up when we can and when we're able and when we need to step back, other folks will step up and we can come back when we're ready. And that's kind of just what I tell myself, is making that commitment to radical hope that we will survive.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, sorry,
Yes,
Jessica.
yeah, no, no worries. Yes, I just wanted to kind of share a teaching that Mohawk elders have taught me where they always mention, and this is hard to hear, especially when you're younger, because when we're younger, we want change rapidly, and we also have mental health concerns that actually impact us. They always say change happens in 3 generations. And that means that the change that we are actually pushing forward is something that we might not be able to see because we're not going to be alive. And I think that in order for us to continue keeping that hope, we have to understand that colonialism, right? It's like layers that have been kind of built on our societies. And I often tell my students when I'm teaching, because to be honest, this is a sentiment that is very common nowadays, that colonialist decolonizing is kind of like peeling onions, right? Where you're peeling the layers of onions. And with that, you're going to be crying. And that crying kind of resembles the healing that we all have to endure. And I often also teach them this Mohawk teaching, which is change happens in 3 generations. And I think that oftentimes that helps them change our perspectives or helps us change our perspectives because we always want to see change, right? We always want to be hopeful, but in reality, sometimes we have to face the harsh realities that are existing today, especially under this administration that is creating a lot of violence and a lot of harm towards many of our communities of color. And thank you again for to that person who asked that question.
Thank you both so much for those beautiful answers, and I apologize for cutting you off, Dr. Hernandez. Um, so we would like to, because you were both talking about hope in different ways as a beautiful counter towards climate anxiety. And we have a question about hope on here. Becca Nixon asked, what gives you hope about the future of climate resilience in King County or the state?
I could take a crack at that one. I think a lot of things give me hope about climate resilience at the state level, which is what I focus on day to day. Um, I think climate resilience is a kind of to the question before too. I think climate resilience is a tricky thing because the scary stuff makes the news, right? Like the floods, the wildfires. When a community doesn't flood, when a community doesn't burn down in a wildfire, like that's expected and like it's good, but like that you don't see a lot of that work. And like we just heard an example from my colleagues a couple of weeks ago about the city of White Salmon, Washington, and the Department of Natural Resources last spring, I believe, did like a wild sort of forest treatment to like do some thinning in an area of the forest there to kind of reduce wildfire risk. And that area saw a huge wildfire over the summer. And as it came towards the city, and that work slowed down the fire enough that crews were able to treat it and then protect the city of White Salmon from being burned. And that like work like that is so incredible and just really hopeful for me. But it's hard because that doesn't necessarily like that's a great story, right? But it's you don't see that all the time. You always, you see a lot of like the bad things when these emergencies happen, and that can definitely be really heavy and weighing on people. But I think one thing for me, it's and to that point is just like there's a lot of really great work happening at all kinds of different scales. Like that's a really big project, and an example of that. We're doing really small work about like infrastructure grants at the state awards. Like how can we better make sure that as we're investing public tax dollars that we're considering climate and how those decisions get made, how projects get cited and designed. So really small things like that too. And there's just a lot of work going on. Kind of have to dig for it, which is not always ideal. But I think just really looking at like all different scales of like there's a lot of really incredible people doing a lot of really incredible work. And that just gets me excited and coming back day after day.
Thank you so much for that, Jimmy. Do we have any closing last remarks from our panelists before we have some Basilica wrap up?
I wanted to answer one more question that didn't get asked yet. There was a question in the chat about what small scale ways to build community resilience, and something I feel like I've learned in the last year or two. I've been reporting on grants, and I've been wanting to report on people saying in meetings, in community meetings, I feel a little bit better. I feel heard. I've met my neighbor, and it feels funny reporting on that because it's not really quantifiable. It's just someone feels better. But I've been doing it, and funders are like are into it. And then I've also been realizing that we can do that in more active ways, like a block party, actively meeting your neighbors. It's not like a go bag, but it's so valuable to be able to call someone and say, "Oh my God, I'm flooding," or "Is your basement dry?" or "Do you have a generator?" Or "Can you help me situate the sump pump?" Those are really, really valuable, tangibly, but also obviously emotionally and mentally. And so just making that the smallest effort to meet your neighbor, I think, is something that we can do and that we can really know that there's value in that. So just want to throw that out there.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm so sorry. I need to take a sip of water really quick. I apologize. It's that time of year. Thank you so much to our panelists for all of those answers and for just being in community and conversation with us tonight. Again, we would like to extend our thank you to Kat, Dr. Hernandez, Jimmy, Emily, and Robin. You are such a dream to work with, and we are so grateful for your time and thoughtfulness. Really fangirling, I'm not gonna lie. But also for our audience, we want to make sure that you guys do know that we are raffling off 2 go bags. Thank you to panelists for, propping up the go bags multiple times. That was really awesome. We are raffling off 2 fully stocked, hand stocked go bags, which are really great for this emergency preparedness. Yeah, thank you so much for attending. Quinn, can I hand it over to you?
Absolutely. If any of you would like to attend more Basilica Bio events, please follow our Luma calendar and subscribe to our newsletter. You can find that on our website. And we're working really hard to expand our public programming. And so if anyone in the audience or the panel wants to work with us more, we'd love to hear from you at info@basilicabio.org. And also please follow us on Instagram. We post extremely innovative and exciting Instagram content. And thank you all so much. And we wish you the absolute best and hope that you're staying safe, warm, and dry in this winter. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.